In every new experience of life, we have two choices. Either we trust God, and that brings out the best in us, or we retreat from trusting God, and Satan brings out the worst. So where are we in the Old Testament when we get to Numbers chapter 10? God's people had been camped at Mount Sinai for about 11 months. They had arrived there 3 months after their deliverance from Egypt. And so we're basically in the second year of the Exodus. The memory of the parting of the sea, the judgments of God against Egypt are fresh in their minds. At this point of the stories in Numbers, God's law had been given. The tabernacle, the mobile worship center, had been constructed and dedicated. Moses had consecrated the priests, the Levites, the workers of the tabernacle. They'd counted the soldiers, they'd organised the tribes. Israel was now a nation ready for action. You might say that the first 10 chapters of Numbers, the children of Israel couldn't or didn't put a foot wrong. They knew God's blessing. Concerning the number of the tribes in Numbers 154, it says the children of Israel did according to all that the Lord commanded Moses. So did they. And that expression or similar is repeated right through the first 10 chapters. When they arranged the 12 tribes in chapter 2, verse 34, thus the children of Israel did according to all that the Lord commanded Moses. When it came to numbering the Levites 20 years and over in chapter 3, verse 16, so Moses numbered them according to the word of the Lord as he was commanded, with the redemption of the firstborn by a money payment. It says in chapter 3, verse 51, according to the word of the Lord, as the Lord commanded Moses. There's a further numbering of the Levites, this time between the ages of 30 and 50. Those that were able-bodied, able to work in the tabernacle. It says, according to the commandment of the Lord, they were numbered by the hand of Moses in 449. Chapter after chapter, God says, and his people do. When they put out those that were sick or unclean in chapter 5, verse 4, as the Lord spoke to Moses, so the children of Israel did. When God told them how to arrange the lamps in the tabernacle, they did so as the Lord commanded Moses in chapter 8, verse 3. When they cleansed and dedicated the Levites for the service of God in chapter 8, verse 20, they did so according to all that the Lord commanded Moses. When the Levites got busy serving God, they did so as the Lord commanded Moses concerning the Levites, so they did. When God reminded them to keep the Passover in chapter 9, verse 5, they kept the Passover according to all that the Lord commanded Moses, so the children of Israel did. Now, there's a blessed monotony in that. It's a blessed monotony. Because it sure beats them disobeying the Lord chapter after chapter. And it put them in the very right place to enjoy God's power and his promises. In fact, concerning their initial journey in chapter 9, verse 23, at the command of the Lord they remained encamped, and at the command of the Lord they journeyed. They kept the charge of the Lord. In obeying God, the children of Israel were invincible. They're invincible. Now, I'm not saying they weren't going to have any challenges or problems. They were going into the promised land and they were going to have a fight on their hands, but they were going to have the Lord on their side. In obeying God, they had a guaranteed future. Think about that. A guaranteed future. There are few guarantees in this life apart from, death and taxes. But even people seem to manage to get around taxes, I've noticed. Well, death is guaranteed. But as we obey the Lord, there is a guaranteed future. In Proverbs 4:18, it says, the path of the just is like a shining sun that shines ever brighter unto the perfect day. And so the first 10 chapters of Numbers is very positive and everything's moving in the right direction. And of course, We know human nature, and we know what it is to be human and to stumble at sin. There is going to be a fall that's going to come very quickly to God's people out there in the wilderness. The next 38 years is going to be characterized not by obedience, but by unbelief and failure. They would wander for a generation because they would not continue to take God at his word. Of that generation, only Joshua and Caleb survived to enter Canaan. It's not until Numbers 26, when things seem to get back on track, Moses takes another numbering of the people and prepares them to enter the land and to conquer and to claim the inheritance. And so when we get to chapter 10, we have in that first section that we didn't read the first section, just a lot of names. We have an ordering of the tribes as they marched. Verse 11 says that it came to pass on the 20th day in the second year of the second month in the second year that the cloud was taken up from above the tabernacle of the testimony, and the children of Israel set out from the wilderness of Sinai on their journeys. Then the cloud settled down in the wilderness of Paran. For 11 months, the cloud stayed put. Almost 1 year. And so life had become very predictable. And then God decided to get his people moving. The trumpets blew by the priests, the tabernacle dismantled, the 12 tribes began to march in the order that God gave them. They had become comfortable at Sinai, living in the same place for nearly a year, without the rigors of a daily march, each morning gathering manna by God's gracious hand. I mean, when you stay put in any place, you can have predictability. You can plan. You can have social gatherings and get-togethers. There's a lot of pluses for just sort of staying somewhere in the same place, but not if you are the children of Israel in the wilderness. Your job is to move when God tells you to move. Their inheritance was not Mount Sinai. Their inheritance was the promised land. Their inheritance was, we will find out, a land not just with milk and honey, but flowing with milk and honey. They had something to look forward to. If there was any consolation for the dust and dirt and the heat and the cold of the wilderness, it was this land flowing with milk and honey. It was time for them to move on in obedience to God. You see, the more comfortable we become, the less we welcome change. Comfort usually leads to complacency, and complacency is always the enemy of growth. And I'm not just talking about geographical change, I'm talking about just life changes, where God pushes us forward into another area of service or ministry or responsibility, whatever it is. We dare not become complacent. Most of us are creatures of habit. And so any kind of change we can naturally become resistant to. In every new experience of life, we have two choices. Either we trust God, and that brings out the best in us, or we retreat from trusting God, and Satan brings out the worst. Pursuing God in change will bring out the best in us and will better conform us to the image of his Son. So God would lead them by the cloud. In Psalm 72, it says, "You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron." And as you notice, as the tribes are ordered in chapter 10, that even the order of their march was ordained by God. Judah was going to lead the 12 tribes. So technically, Judah gets there first. Yeah? Judah gets there first when they enter the promised land. How they marched wasn't an option, it was a divine obligation. If Dan or Asher up the back got tired, they wanted to be up the front. They wanted to sit up the front. I'm always in the back, I want to sit up the front. Well, Moses would say, in his own way, too bad. Too bad. God has commanded the ordering of the tribes, and when every tribe is in their place, it sort of ends arguments. Yeah, it ends arguments. This was God's order. The will of God was not to be negotiable. It's been said that the people of Israel were not on a pleasure trip looking at scenery. They were an army invading enemy territory. They had to march in their tribes, be ready for battle, because this was not a holiday they were on. They were coming to reclaim the land that God had given them. They had to get to God's destination God's way. They had to go to God's place by God's method and command. He would do so by leading them through a cloud. There's a very interesting incident in verse 29, because Moses says to his brother-in-law, Hobab, we know Hobab's father as Jethro. Sometimes Bible characters go by different names. But Hobab was Moses' brother-in-law. It seems that Jethro is dead by now. Otherwise, Moses would be speaking to him. So he speaks to his brother-in-law and he says, listen, we are setting out for the place of which the Lord said, I'll give it to you. That's where we're going. And then Moses says, come with us. Come along. And we'll treat you well, for the Lord has promised good things to Israel. You can sense the excitement in Moses' voice. Hobab is family. He's family by marriage. And Moses wants to graciously include him into the very promises of God. He says, come along, God has so many good things. And you know what? Moses was right. God did have good things for God's people. God was going to make their life better in the promised land, not any worse. Moses wanted his family by marriage to travel with Israel and enjoy the blessings of the Lord. They were a good fit. They'd known each other for many years. You can sense his enthusiasm. I think of the song that we had in our service today, Amazing Grace. The Lord has promised good to me. His word my hope secures. He will my shield and portion be as long as life endures. You could have taken that from Numbers chapter 10. We need to share in that kind of enthusiasm that God has promised wonderful things to his children as they serve him and as they live for him, not without challenges and problems and all those sort of things, but you'd rather do life with God than without him. Have God as your Lord and Savior, not as your judge, as your opponent. Now, Hobab predictably says in verse 30, I will not go, but I'll depart, and notice the answer. Notice the answer. To my own land and to my relatives. My relatives. He has the prospect of joining with Moses and God's people. He's well aware of what God did to Egypt and Pharaoh. So Moses' God is greater than Pharaoh, all the gods of Egypt. But home is calling Moses' brother-in-law. Depart to my own land and to my relatives. They must have got on. Yeah? They must have got on. This must have been a very loving family. And he says, I want to stay with my family. Why should he sacrifice comfort and security for an unknown fear just on what Moses had told him? Remember, Ruth gave the opposite answer to Naomi. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Your country will be my country. She gives the exact opposite. In fact, Jesus said in Matthew 10:37, he who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Friends, if your family ties are greater than your willing obedience to God, you're an unworthy follower of Christ. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. How many parents keep their children back from serving the Lord because there's no future in that? There's no future in that. Well, friends, there's a great future in serving God. There's an eternal future in serving the Lord Jesus Christ. Well, Moses lays it on even more in verse 31. He said, please do not leave. Moses isn't going to take no for an answer. Inasmuch as you know how we are to camp in the wilderness, and you can be our eyes. He says, in effect, listen, it's not that simple. I want you to come, but I need you to come. I need you. Because you know all about this place. You know all about this land. I don't. You can be our eyes. You know the contours and the hills and the valleys, and you know where to find water, and you know where the challenges are. And look at verse 32. It shall be, if you go with us, indeed it shall be, that whatever good the Lord will do to us, the same we will do to you. You come with us, and all the blessings God gives to us, we're just going to pass it straight on to you. You're going to be equal partners in the blessing. In effect, he says, the destination, my brother-in-law, will be worth the journey. It's going to be worth the journey. Now, it seems that Hobab actually goes along with Moses, because when you get to the book of Judges, some of his descendants are listed as living alongside the children of Israel. Numbers 10 doesn't tell us that, but it seems, looking in later books of the Old Testament, he takes Moses up on his offer. He reconsiders and he follows Moses into this endeavor. Now, the question that people have is, why does Moses bother doing this? Because remember, God promises to lead them by the cloud, right? God is going to lead them. That cloud is going to move whether Moses brings his brother-in-law with him or not. It's going to be the cloud, not Moses, not his brother-in-law, who's going to lead the children of Israel. So the question is, why does Moses bother inviting him along? Was he not trusting in God enough? Why draft a human guide? Why get any human help if the cloud is going to lead you along? It seems to me that there's no question that God was going to lead God's people along. The cloud would direct. But Moses was going to get some very practical help from a man who knew the lay of the land. As they moved, according to the cloud, Moses was going to get some inside information and some help. He was going to get some wise advice. Let me try and put it another way. A believer feels led of the Lord to get married. And there's an engagement. God's leading them. No one's arguing about that. But they're going to seek out some counseling before they get married. Sure, God's leading them, but they are going to need some help to prepare, not for the wedding day, for what happens after the wedding day. A Christian wants to be a missionary. No one's doubting that. What do they need to do? They need to talk to some people who have been missionaries. That's what they need to do. So wants to start a business. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. Go talk to someone that's run a business or two. Get some advice. How many Christians have felt that they should join Missionary Aviation Fellowship so they can fly aircrafts around the world to help missionaries? You know what they're going to do? They're going to get flying lessons. That's what they're going to do. Well, God's called them. We're not doubting that, but they need to get some assistance and some expertise. See, it's Spurgeon who said concerning this incident, we ought to learn from this, I think, that while we ever seek the guidance of God in providence, we may frequently find direction and guidance in the use of our own common sense and our own discretion with which the Lord has endowed us. Romans 12 talks about discerning and proving the good, acceptable, perfect will of God. That God was leading Moses and his people through the cloud didn't stop Moses from getting some help and some advice from someone who had actually lived in that area. And God doesn't rebuke Moses for that, doesn't rebuke him. This was a very wise move. And then if you look from verse 33 through to 36, we have what would become the pattern for all future moves. For all future moves. As the cloud led them by day, it says in verse 35, whenever the ark set out, that Moses said, so whenever there was a move, he was going to say this, rise up, O Lord, rise up, O Lord. Let your enemies be scattered. This was their prayer as they moved. And let those who hate you flee before you, whether they stayed for a few days or a few weeks or a few months. Whenever they moved, they said, Lord, rise up. Come with us, be with us, defeat our enemies. And when the cloud stopped, when it stopped, they would say, return, O Lord, to the many thousands of Israel. It's really to the many thousands and thousands of Israel. They sought God's protection and his blessing every time they moved and stayed put. So guess what was happening every time Israel moved? Every time they moved, they were getting a lesson about trusting in God. Now, God didn't leave it up to them to pray. He said, whenever you move and whenever you stay put, you are to call out to me. Blessing of habits. The blessing of doing and repeating things so that they become a habit. Certainly this reminded God's children that it was God and not Moses in charge. They were calling out to the Lord for help. Israel was an army that depended on God for victory. These prayers would teach God's people that they needed the Lord for everything. Without him, they were nothing. Without God, they had no hope of ever getting out of Egypt, and they're out. They're free. They're free. And if they're to go into the promised land, they're going to need as much of God's help as they needed in the past. Just like you and I needed God's saving grace, we need his leading grace and his guiding help. These prayers were essential to Israel's well-being. They needed to call out to God like this. You know, God promises to provide our needs, and he tells us to pray for our daily bread. That's what he does. He promises he'll look after those who follow him, who know him, and he says, pray for your daily bread. While God led them, he expected them to pray. While God fed them, he expected them to pray. That's what God expects of us as his children, to daily depend on him and to express that dependence on him through prayer. Without him, we can do nothing. And frankly, had Israel meditated more on these very simple prayers, they would have been in the promised land a generation earlier. They would have prayed their way into the promised land, right? They would have prayed their way in. But they drew back and wouldn't trust in the Lord. The faith that Moses here gives to them and says, call out to God, trust him, look to him. Now look at that. Look at those prayers again. Look at verse 35. Let your enemies be scattered. Let those who hate you flee before you. Do you know, friends, that one day that will be eternally true? One day, God is going to make sure that every one of his enemies is eternally scattered, and condemned. He's going to do that. That prayer is going to be universally true one day. And then he says, return, O Lord, to the many thousands of Israel. Friends, one day God is going to scoop up the last saint, the last one. And heaven's going to be full of his redeemed. It's going to be complete. And that's going to be eternally true. It's a contrast to all the drama that follows. It's a contrast. God had prepared them and said, by the way, whenever you move, I want you to call upon me and trust me, and I'll come to your aid and I'll help you. I'll scatter your enemies and I'll come back to you. And so chapter 10 is this backdrop to all that's going to happen later on. It will condemn them to a large degree, all the help that God was willing to give them. Let me read from Hebrews 10. Let me just read from Hebrews 10, 36 to 38. The writer says, but you have need of endurance. So after that you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. For yet a little while, and he who is coming will come and not tarry. But the just shall live by faith. But if any man draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. The destination for us as believers is worth the journey. It's worth whatever setbacks and discouragements and difficulties we have. The destination to be with Christ is always worth it.